Hey there, snowflakes. Today I would like to tell you about my 1975 Snowbug. Hey everybody, before we get started, I would just like to point out that this is not a history of Snowbug video. This is basically just a slideshow journey with, some video clips of the work that I've done on my own Snowbug. If you're interested, there's a great video that was put out by the Sudbury News that was called Snowbug Fever and features a couple of enthusiasts and their machines. And I'll put a link here if you want to go check that out. Here's the machine as my dad picked it up for me, so you can see they're pretty unique looking. They have a single ski on the front. They have a really wide track, and you sit in it and drive it like you would sort of drive a car. It's got pedals for a gas and a brake. The seat was pretty torn up and missing some foam. The track was kind of a mess. Not a mess, it's just old, and the belting was really worn out and ragged. Here's a good view of the rear end of the machine where you can see the engine is mounted. They all came with a rear mounted engine. So to get started on the track, this was a lot of work. I looked around for a good used track, and they're really hard to find, and when it gets right down to it, they're still another 30-year-old track. So I decided to build my own. Here I've got it measured out, and I went to the local belt supply and I had them cut me some new material. I want to say that the disassembly probably took the longest. Now, I guess you could have taken a side grinder to these, but I decided I would center punch and drill all the heads off and then take it apart that way. It seemed like a much neater job. So what I did was I numbered all the pieces first in a certain order, and then I started disassembly. This is a good view of the belting after everything had been taken off, and you can see how terrible shape it is in. In order to get the holes in the correct position on the new belting, what I did was I took the old strip and I screwed it onto a 2x4 over top of the new strip, and then I took a hole punch that I put in a drill, and I went and just transferred all the holes from the old belting to the new. I needed 2 different lengths of solid rivets, which I ordered from an aircraft supply. You need 2 sizes because every now and then there is a sort of a wiper to clean snow out from inside the track, and you need a longer rivet. So here's the first side of the track assembled. This took quite a bit of time, and I probably shouldn't have done it down on the floor. My back was killing me by the time I was done. I think this whole track thing I spread out over 2 weeks, maybe even longer. It took quite a while, but I had plenty of time. Here's the track with all the grosser bars riveted back together. All that's left here now is to put the lacing on. I guess trim the belting and then put the lacing on. This was a little bit tricky. I mean, just a matter of taking your time and using the measuring tape. There's all kinds of styles of belt lacing available. I just went with the same stuff that the machine came with. That was still in serviceable condition on the old track, and just a matter of ordering it the right length. It didn't cost me a bunch of money. I want to say it was like $20 for a set of, I got plenty of lacing left over if I want to do another one. So this alligator style lacing, you basically set it in position, set it on a, I think it was on a piece of steel, and then hammer it into place. It's kind of that easy. As long as you're sure you got it in the right spot, you shouldn't have any trouble. And then you roll it into the machine and slide a pin in, and that's it. It comes with a special pin that kind of locks into place in those teeth. The wear bars on the skid were made out of phenolic sheet. It's pretty expensive stuff, and I couldn't get any locally. So I decided to go a little bit more modern, and I bought, I think it was 3/16 or 1/4 inch UHMW. Here you can see the top strips put onto the skid. I used some slotted brass screw that I found, and I countersunk them on my drill press, and they were perfect. I think Gravy came over and helped me put these slides back together, and you can see there's one side is on backwards. The next day I came out to the garage and discovered that, so it did get flipped around before I got put back in. And there's the whole thing put back into the machine. Now that is quite an ample track. If memory serves, the whole thing is 26 inches wide. It's pretty heavy, but not hard to put in. There isn't much in there. My buddy Kelsey had an old ski rule, I think it was, that had a Sachs 370 in it, and he very generously gave me a smoking deal, and I thought it'd be cool to put it into the Snowbug. So Kelsey came over one day, and we spent the afternoon pulling this thing apart and resealed it and put it back together. If you do work on Sachs engines, you know that they have a threaded flywheel for popping them off. You need a special puller. I've seen guys try to use other stuff, and I guess you can get the job done, but nothing beats having the real deal. They pop right off really easy. This engine had the ignition coil mounted internally. I had some spares from different Sachs engines I had kicking around, so I opted to upgrade the lighting coil to 75 watts and mount the external ignition coil on this motor. When we started taking this engine apart, we found that it was actually in really good shape. So all that really needed doing was putting new crank seals in and replacing the gaskets and just making sure everything was in serviceable order, which it was. Here I took the crank in and put on the lathe and just cleaned up the seal surfaces with some Scotch-Brite. I cleaned up the piston with Scotch-Brite as well. I usually go to Rec Supply to get my gasket sets, but I saw this on Kijiji, so I bought it. It wasn't a lot of money. And I also went to Applied Industrial for new seals for the crank. Here you see the updated stator, as I mentioned before. And also the external ignition coil. I don't know if I will ever put it on, but I had a flywheel with ring gear on it for electric start, so maybe one day when I'm tired of pulling recoils, I'll put the electric start on it. The bigger 370 had a different bolt pattern on the bottom of the crankcase to mount to the engine mount, so I had to take the old engine mount and cut the plate off and make a new plate and then weld it on in order to use the engine. This machine came with an old school Polaris steel clutch from back in the 60s. So I blasted it and cleaned it up and put it on, and it works fine. The exhaust for the 370, it was a little bit bigger than the one that came on the 290 as well. And that also means that it needed a different bracket to hold that on. So I copied the bracket from the exhaust for the 290 and just made it a little bit bigger to wrap around the bigger pipe. And then I blasted and painted the whole pipe and baked it in the barbecue. When I started disassembling the rear end of the machine for the engine and the drive, I found a lot of damaged components, specifically the sheet aluminum and the bars that the engine mounts sit on. They are cracked or broken. So I went to a sheet metal shop and I took the old pieces in that were really damaged or unusable and had them make me some new pieces to put on the machine. Here you can see the rear end of the machine is kind of Swiss cheesed from guys putting different flaps and stuff on the back end over the years. I don't remember why I made a new shaft for the back. For the life of me, I cannot remember, but there it is. This view of the back end shows the new snow flap installed and some of the drive coming together. The first few times I took this machine out, I broke a couple of chains, and it didn't seem to matter how I tensioned it. They seemed to just want to snap. So I had an old Olympic, the Gravy and I picked up, and I took the tensioners out of the chain case and I mounted them onto the Snowbug. Well, I mounted one, and I also modified the bottom sprocket so it floats on there about, I don't know, it's got room for, I don't know, maybe 100th thou or so, and that cured all problems with the chain breaking. And there's the back end, all buttoned up, engines in, everything put back together. It looks really good and everything worked great. I was pretty happy when I reached this milestone, so to speak. Another unique feature of these machines is that they came with jerry can. Probably that the manufacturer just picked up a Canadian Tire, and that's what it used for a gas tank. And not even a big gas tank. It's just like a little 2-gallon tank. I mean, if you're gonna put something on there, like, why wouldn't you go with the 5-gallon? But I guess. Big old HD that came on this machine. I made a little adapter for it to put that Bing air box on it, mostly just so it can catch any extra fuel, because this carb kind of faces down at a 45-degree angle. I've not had great luck with this carburetor, and I am a Tillotson guy. It's not like I'm inexperienced with these things, but this thing just, it hasn't worked great for me. For the chain cover, I made some threaded thumb screws so I could easily take the chain cover off if I needed to. That quickly became necessary when I broke a couple of chains. The irony is, since I've modified the chain tensioning mechanism, I haven't had to take it off. On the right is where the old reflector was mounted, and it was made to hang off the back of the machine like that. I just moved it over onto the chain case. It seemed like a better idea to me. You can still get those reflectors, although they're made of aluminum now. The old one is steel. That's the only reason I put it back on there. Princess Auto was my go-to for a new taillight. This is a good view of the new upholstery. I had Cranky Bill do it for me. He's pretty crusty and half in the bag most of the time, but his prices are good. This didn't need to be perfect. Kelsey grabbed me these handlebars from the dump. He found them on an old big wheel, and I wanted new handlebars because the ones that were on there were sort of a buckhorn style, and they're terribly uncomfortable. I found you could ride any distance and my wrists hurt, and so I took these and I cut them off a little bit shorter, and I ordered some hand grips on eBay. And it makes a world of difference when you're driving a machine. So, as a final note, I should mention that I recently have updated the carburetor on this machine to a Mikuni. I bought a 45-degree gem adapter and a boot, and I mounted the carburetor on there. Another major update that I did was I put a primer on the machine, and what I did is I made a little bracket and I mounted the primer, and I had a spare head for the engine, and the engines had an optional decompressor port on them, and I took a piece from an old Walbro WF carburetor and I drilled and tapped that to fit a banjo fitting from a Yamaha Enticer, and that has a built-in valve in it. Now the whole idea with this primer setup is to get fuel into the cylinder, because with that carburetor hanging off the bottom of the motor, you use the primer, you squirt it in there, and the gas just runs out the mouth of the carburetor. You aren't getting any into the engine. My only concern with this setup is whether the valve on that banjo fitting will hold up under load and sustain compression. I have no idea. We'll see how it goes. I hope it does, because it really makes starting the engine so much nicer.